Yep, that's right, it's Death Company time. I've been looking forward to this one. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of your models on the tabletop. We're continuing our look at the Blood Angels unique units today, and we're taking a look at the Death Company, everyone's favourite howling blood-mad, rage-filled Blood Angels. In this video we'll take a look at the unit's datasheet, discuss their options, any buffs that we can give them, and there are a lot, and how I would personally use a unit of Death Company on the tabletop. In the backgrounds, the Death Company are the Space Marines that have fallen to the Blood Angels' fatal flaw, and have succumbed to the Black Rage, where the visions of their dying Primarch overwhelm their minds, to the point where the Space Marine is completely incapacitated by his fury. He dons the black armour of the Death Company to seek a glorious end in close combat. The Death Company are watched over by their chaplains, whose job it is to keep their fallen charges' rage in check and ensure that it is let out against the enemy army at the appropriate time. I also really like the models too. They come with an absolute ton of interesting close combat weapons and power weapons on the frame, and they're the models that I've used to convert all of my Smash Captains and fighty characters in the past. So let's see what these black-clad death machines can do on the tabletop. So Death Company are a Blood Angels elite choice, and they come in a unit of between 5 and 15 Space Marines, so you can have really quite a big unit of them if you want to. They've received a very decent buff in the new chapter approved, dropping from 17 points base to 15 points. So now a Death Company model with a jump pack will cost you 18 points if you give him no additional war gear, as jump packs cost an extra 3 points. Their basic stat line is a movement of 6, weapon skill and ballistic skill of 3 up, strength and toughness of 4, 1 wound, 2 attacks, leadership 7 and a 3 up save. It's worth noting that they don't have a squad sergeant, so they are only leadership 7, which almost uniquely for Space Marines actually poses an actual weakness leadership wise. Because you can take them in such big units, there are times when you might lose the last couple of Death Company to morale. It seems interesting that they've given Death Company this particular weakness, as to my mind if there's ever any Space Marines that aren't going to show any fear of the enemy and just plunge headlong into close combat, then you'd think it'd be them. On the other hand, it might be to represent the fact that they're undisciplined and might be prone to strange, unproductive behaviour compared with their battle brothers. Their movement increases to 12 and they gain fly if they take the jump pack. I would typically take the jump pack because of this. And they also have a 6 up feel no pain type save from Black Rage. So a tiny bit more durable than regular Space Marines, but it's not ideal on 1 wound models because if you get hit by multi-damage weapons, then they pretty much make this save meaningless. Their 2 attacks is pretty nice, that can go up significantly. On the charge they'll have 1 for Shock Assault and 1 for Black Rage, also 1 for their Chainsword, so that's 5 attacks on the charge under normal circumstances. If they happen to be in the Blood Angels unique doctrine, they'll get yet another attack on the charge, and all of those attacks will be AP -1. So just theoretically, if you did have a 15-man Death Company squad just with Chainswords drop down on turn 3, which will set you back 270 points incidentally, you'll have a unit that will pump out 90, strength 4 attacks at AP -1, plus 1 to wounds, and you'll make a nasty mess of basically whatever you charge at. To put this in perspective, they'll do 10 wounds to an Imperial Knight, and that's probably one of the least optimal targets you can throw them at, as it's toughness 8. So it just goes to show just how much damage the basic Death Company can do when they're in that assault doctrine. Getting back on track, each basic Death Company model is armed with a bolt pistol, chainsword and frag and crack grenades, and they have a whole ton of options for fancy close combat weapons. Firstly, any model might replace its bolt pistol with either a bolt gun, hand flamer, inferno pistol, plasma pistol, power axe, power fist, power maul, or power sword. So a lot of toys to play with there. One of the most obvious changes that I can see is to replace the bolt pistol for a bolt gun, as both are free, and the bolt gun is basically a flat upgrade on the bolt pistol. This means that on the turn that you drop in, a 10-man unit of Death Company will be able to put out a flurry of bolter shots, either at 12 or 24 inch range before they charge in for the kill, and have absolutely no downside in close combat. It's not really the biggest change in the world, and it could be annoying to model, but if you're looking to run Death Company absolutely optimally, then that's probably a good change. The other options are a little bit more hit and miss for me. The hand flamers are pretty decent value at just 1 point additional, but you can't fire them the turn that you drop in because they're too short ranged, which is a negative. Inferno pistols suffer the same problem, unfortunately. Plasma pistols do have range, but you're only really going to get the proper value out of them if you overcharge, and for me personally, I wouldn't want to be losing my very expensive Death Company models to plasma pistol shots, so I'd probably not bother. In terms of the power weapons, you can also swap your chainsword out for these as well in the next option. So this actually makes an interesting choice. You can either swap out the bolt gun for one of these options and lose some shooting power, or you can swap out your chainsword for one of these and lose some close combat power. It's interesting that you could have Death Company, say, each with a power fist and chainsword. So if you had a 10-man squad all with power fists and chainswords, which is again 270 points, you'd be getting a colossal 50 power fist attacks on the charge, and also 10 bonus chainsword attacks. So it's kind of up to you whether you want to have your extra attack in close combat via the chainsword, or decent shooting with the bolt gun. They also have the option to swap out both the chainsword and the bolt pistol for a thunderhammer. The way that you build the model, he's carrying a thunderhammer in 2 arms. This certainly isn't a bad pick at all. If you were going for a mainly chainsword Death Company unit, just throwing in a thunderhammer or 2 for 16 points each could be pretty decent. When your enemy tries to wipe out the unit, they will probably be the last ones left, and they might still be able to achieve something very significant with those massive close combat weapons before they actually go down. Say if we did have a unit of 10 Death Company, with 5 of them with chainswords and then 5 of them with thunderhammers, this loadout will cost us 260 points. Then we'll get a colossal 20 thunderhammer attacks on the charge and 25 chainsword attacks on the charge. If we hit that poor knight with them again, we'll do an average of 24 wounds to it, giving us a very decent chance of just one-shotting it straight away. Basically, Death Company have a near unlimited damage potential when they're both combined with buffing characters and with stratagems, such as, say, Fight Again. It costs 3 CP, but maybe you could kill 2 knights in one turn. But their main weakness is going to be reaching their targets, and also the fact that they're not that durable. They're very likely to be one-hit wonders unless you can do anything clever to prevent them from just being gunned off the tabletop after they've had their fight. The Death Company do have a few special rules that we've not mentioned. In addition to the Black Rage for the extra 6 up, Feel No Pain and extra attack, we have Angels of Death for Shock Assault, Bolter Discipline, and Combat Doctrines, and if they have jump packs, then they have the Jump Pack Assault special rule, which means that you can set them up off the board. I would often do this, but there will be games when I'd consider starting them on the board, particularly if you either have first turn or can hide them out of line of sight, as there's some tricks that they can do with stratagems to redeploy, as we'll see in a second. So in summary, Death Company are a ridiculously hard-hitting melee unit, but are pretty weak durability-wise, as they have a really high points per wound, and it only gets worse when you're giving them their fancy wargear options. They're basically going to be wanting to engage the heaviest thing that your opponent has around, and just annihilate the enemy army as quickly as possible. But they're incredibly fragile in defense, and unless you're very fortunate, they're a threat that's likely to be neutralized very quickly after they make their impact due to how dangerous they are and how fragile they are to enemy return fire. So let's take a look at a few of the combos and buffs that we can use with Death Company. Firstly, it's worth noting that the Blood Angels have all manner of fighty characters that can buff the damage output of Death Company and the other deep striking hard-hitting units. Obviously we've got the Captain and Lieutenant, and Dante the Chapter Master for full rerolls, or perhaps Gabriel Seth if we're playing Flesh Tearer Death Company. The Sanguinor can also help damage output a lot, giving them +1 attack, and Librarians can cast either a 5+ invul save on them to help with durability, or another attack via Unleash Rage, and if we're counting all the stacking buffs now, your basic Death Company with a chainsword could potentially be up to 8 attacks already, and then 16 if he fights twice. If you focus your army around them, then they really can reach hilarity levels of rage and damage output. Sanguinary Priests could add +1 to the strength of the Death Company as well, and that's quite a nice bracket to be in because strength 5 with +1 to wound is wounding pretty much anything in the game on a 4+, and anything that's toughness 5 or lower very easily indeed. Out of all the buffs characters though, it might be the Chaplains that have the greatest synergy with the Death Company. Both Astaroth and Lamates are jump pack Chaplains that have good Death Company synergy, and Chaplains also mitigate the Death Company's leadership problem a little by giving them their own leadership. Lamates allows Death Company to reroll charges, which is absolutely crucial as you're not going to get any of this massive value out of them if they don't connect with the enemy. Combined with the Blood Angel's new improved Red Thirst, he gives you a 64% chance to make the charge out of Deep Strike, which is already good odds. The chaplains can also recite the litany to give any friendly models within 6 inches +2 to their charges. Obviously they have to start on the battlefield for this, but this plus Lamartie's reroll will give them around about an 83% chance at getting that charge out of deep strike, so that's pretty reliable. Asterath also has some good synergy. His Redeemer of the Lost actually makes Death Company completely fearless when they're near him. He can now recite 2 litanies, so he could have the +2 to charge and the reroll hits in the fight phase, which is absolutely brilliant for Death Company. Plus he also has Mass of Doom, which could give +1 to hit for nearby units, though they would have to start on the board to activate this because it happens at the start of the movement phase. Finally, the Sanguinary Ancient can also help their leadership a little by giving them +1 leadership and give them reroll once to wound in the fight phase. He's now very cheap, this little guy, and he has a good synergy with the Death Company. In terms of characters, it's clear that you could go absolutely overboard on buffs for the Death Company, and if you put all of these buffs on one squad, then you could have a damage spike that is ridiculously high. The thing is, it's never really going to matter if you have unlimited damage, because the Death Company will probably already kill whatever they touch quite decently even without buffs. I maybe think about 1 or 2 fighty buffs at most, but focus on keeping them safe and ensuring that they make that charge so they get some damage in the first place. Just for the sake of fun though, if we took a max Death Company squad all with Thunderhammers, stacked every single attack buff that we can get on them, and also gave them 4 rerolls to hit and rerolls 1 to wound, and then use Honour the Chapter to fight twice, that little combo will do us a casual 450 damage on average to an Imperial Knight when they're in the Blood Angels Assault Doctrine. Quite obviously, that's never going to happen. It's ludicrously expensive to pull off, and for all you know, the Knights might be well screened behind a bunch of Guardsmen, so you might just have done 450 damage to 10 Imperial Guardsmen instead. But I think that it helps prove my point that you don't need to go overboard on buffing the melee capacity of the Death Company. You need to consider how much you want to invest, and the actual challenge is more going to be how to deliver them into hard targets without losing loads to Overwatch, or just getting shot off the board next turn, having killed far fewer points than you invested in them. In terms of relics, there are a few that can help out the Death Company. My biggest picks would be the Icon of the Angel from the new Blood of Baal supplement. This will let you reroll your charges, and you can plonk it on any character that you've taken along to buff the Death Company. Obviously not named characters. As we've already said, reroll charges are very good indeed with the Death Company. You can't afford to be spending loads of points in a melee unit and not have them make it into close combat. Secondly, I really like the Quake Bolts. If you have a character who is carrying a bolter, then he can shoot at an enemy unit, and in the ensuing fight phase, your units will be +1 to hit that unit. This is a massive buff, 25% buff to your already ludicrously dangerous Death Company. For the cost of buying one extra relic, could easily be worth it. That's another very strong pick in my opinion. So, stratagems next then. Death Company have several very useful stratagems, and you could easily dump loads of command points into them to ensure that you get the most value out of them and make sure they connect with the enemy. Forlorn Fury is 2 command points, and that allows a Death Company infantry unit to move before the first turn has begun. You can move and advance them, so that should be 12 inches plus d6 with their jump packs. As it's before the first turn, that advance won't stop them charging. This means that if you know you have first turn, you could set them up on the line, use this to move up very far in the first turn, and then with your ensuing 12-inch movement in turn 1, you should be able to get easily into the enemy's deployment zone and hopefully make some key charges to wreck some face. Very strong stratagem. Could get you a guaranteed first turn charge, particularly if your opponent deploys units quite far up to meet your Death Company. Upon Wings of Fire is another one. It's now 2 command points as per the Blood Angels FAQ, as it's a very, very good ability indeed. This is another way that you can get a turn 1 charge with Death Company. Basically, if they have jump packs and they're set up in your deployment zone, at the start of the movement phase they can be taken off the table, and you set it up at the end of the movement phase as if it's coming in from reserve. You can do this turn 1, and it means that suddenly the enemy has got a massive amount of Death Company on their doorstep, ready to scythe down their models, maybe kill a whole bunch of chaff units, ready for the next drop to come in turn 2. Another really, really solid stratagem. The sooner that you can get your Death Company to connect with the foe, the better, and this is a way that you can do that. Next up, we have another very powerful Death Company stratagem, which is Descent of Angels. This is the one that lets you make a 3d6-inch charge instead of a 2d6-inch, so that makes the Death Company charge very likely to pass, even with no buffs at all. Now Blood Angels automatically get +1 to their charge rolls via the new Red Thirst. They are very, very likely to make that charge indeed. You probably don't need to buff them up with anything else and could just use a command reroll. if that 3d6 looks pitifully low. This will get you in the majority of the time, but obviously it has a cost, and that cost is 2 command points. I think we're beginning to see exactly why Blood Angels lists are so command point thirsty. Finally, at the main codex, we've got Honour the Chapter, which is your 3 command point stratagem to fight again. As we've said, Death Company are ludicrously capable of killing things in close combat. If you can use the unit to hit one large target to death and then use the consolidation to get them close to another unit that you've declared a charge on, you can pile into that unit and shred them as well. You could also use this for tying up important enemy shooting units if you're just outside of consolidation range of tying up a whole bunch of tanks, for example, though it is quite pricey. From Blood of Bar we gain access to Transhuman Physiology and Refusal to Die, 2 command points and 1 command point respectively. Transhuman Physiology will allow your Death Company to only be wounded on 4+ at best, which could actually really help them survive a bit, seeing as they might well be targeted by weapons that are strength 5 or better. It is pricey though at 2 command points, and it won't necessarily save them as they are fragile anyway. Refusal to Die is a stratagem that upgrades their durability from a 6-up Feel No Pain save to a 5-up Feel No Pain save. That's a pretty decent upgrade, and basically amounts to a 28% durability increase against damage 1 attacks, but if you're being hit by multi-damage weapons, its efficiency drops off quite a lot. They're both possible ways to try and keep your Death Company alive for another turn, or at least make your opponent have to sacrifice more firepower to chew through them. You could potentially combine the two to make them super durable for one shooting phase or something, but to be honest, Blood Angels are very squeezed for their command points. I'm not sure that it's going to be worth it throwing all these command points after hopefully keeping a Death Company unit alive. You never know, they could both be used situationally. They have Hammer of Wrath, which is another damage increase. When you make a jump pack unit charge, each model within 1 inch of the enemy will inflict a mortal wound on a 5-up. Most useful on an enormous unit of Death Company, say 15 guys coming in. In theory you could have around about 5 mortal wounds for 1 command point, which is generally good. The only thing to consider is though that if you do have 15 Death Company making a charge into the enemy, then whatever they're hitting is quite likely going to be dead anyway. And is it really worth putting an additional 5 mortal wounds on something that's already going to be blown to bits by fancy close combat weapons? Possibly not. Unbridled Ardour is one of the most interesting and powerful buffs that the Blood Angels got from Blood of Bar. If your opponent leaves an enemy unit anywhere within 6 inches at the beginning of the charge phase, then you can pay 1 command point to have your Death Company heroically intervene into them. This is absolutely massive, as it could give you an entire extra combat phase, and as we all know, Death Company are absolutely monstrous in close combat. If you ever get the chance to get a free combat phase out of them for just 1 command point, then it's almost always going to be worth it. It's situational, but the Death Company are going to be active within your opponent's lines, so it might come up a little bit more often than you think. So let's take a look at how I would personally run Death Company on the battlefield. Firstly, when building them, I would set them up with jump packs as opposed to without. I know that you can potentially put them in Rhinos or Land Raiders, but to my mind these things just aren't reliable at delivering them into close combat. If there was something that could let the vehicle move, them get out and charge, then that would be a different story, but unfortunately that's not the case. I personally prefer them with jump packs. In terms of unit construction, you could really go as big or small as you wanted, and tailor the units to fill the role that you need. You could use a unit of 12 Death Company with chainswords as a infantry and screen clearing unit, for example. Although, as we said in the Knight example earlier, they hit decently hard against pretty much most targets as well. You could have a dedicated anti-tank unit with 5 guys equipped with power fists. That little unit will do on average 14 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle with no other buffs at all, so it could be a good commando unit to eliminate more minor battlefield threats. My personal instinct though would be to run a mid-sized Death Company squad, big enough to buff and achieve a horrendous amount of damage output, but not over-investing the points, so you're spending your extra points on a lot of fragile marines who are just going to do overkill and then just get gunned down anyway. My temptation would be something along the lines of 10 Death Company, 3 with Thunderhammers, and the other 7 with Chainsword and Bolter. I think a decent sized unit is certainly helpful for tanking Overwatch. Even if you're charging something with horrendous Overwatch, at least the Thunderhammers should hopefully make it to their target and kill whatever it was that presumed to keep them away. That unit build is 228 points at the moment, so it's not an enormous chunk of your army, and it could do a reasonable amount of damage even without support. I probably would buy some support for it. I'd be tempted to bring Lamates along, ideally start him on the board, and use him to give the Death Company +2 inch to the charge, and to give his reroll of charge rolls to the Death Company. If you didn't fancy buffing up the charges of the Death Company, you could instead spend the 2 CP to get them that 3d6 inch charge, and maybe just buy them some basic character support. I'd be very tempted by a captain with a bolt gun with those quake bolts, so if you manage to drop him down and keep him in range of the Death Company, you could have them hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s, which is a pretty decent buff to their damage output for a very cheap points cost. Really, there's all sorts of deep strike buffs available to Blood Angels. At some point we might do a video on them specifically. There are a whole ton of different ways to make Death Company stronger, as we've already discussed, and each of them will have different merits in different scenarios. I could certainly see myself running 2 or even 3 units of Death Company like this, and I'd be particularly incentivized to bring more than 1 unit along if I was bringing Lamates along, as Death Company are basically what he does. If I was to bring multiple units of Death Company, I'd probably think about starting 1 on the board, particularly if I had first turn, and putting the other 1 or 2 in Deep Strike Reserve. For any Death Company units starting on the board, if we know that we're getting first turn, then they can deploy up on the line, ready to use Forlorn Fury to get a first turn charge, and get stuck straight into the enemy. If we know that we've got second turn, I'd most likely deploy them out of line of sight within a ruin, and use On Wings of Fire to jump them across the board turn 1 to again get a first turn charge. If we are using Lamates or any other buffing characters with jump packs, we could think about starting them on the board and moving them up alongside them, though this might hamper the charge range if you are going for first turn charges. If the enemy has a whole ton of ignores line of sight weaponry, or if there's no decent terrain to hide your Death Company behind, and there's a reasonable chance of you going second, I'd probably just think about putting all of my units in Deep Strike Reserve. If you lose a very big expensive unit like this to a small amount of enemy firepower, then you're in for a bad time. With the deep striking squads, I'd want to drop them alongside whichever character support that I brought in. There's merits to dropping them down turn 2 as you get their damage output earlier in the game, and also advantages to dropping in turn 3 when you might have the Blood Angels Assault Doctrine active. It depends whether or not your opponent has exposed sufficient targets for them to be worth dropping on turn 2, or whether you need extra turns to clear screens in other ways. If we are using a chaplain to buff charge ranges and maybe Lamates to reroll charges, then it's probably worth trying to start Lamates on the board somewhere hidden and protected and screened by your units. He could then move and advance up to meet your deep striking Death Company, and allow them to have his +2 inch charge aura, because he can't cast that if he's in Deep Strike Reserve. If you're not using chaplains, then I'd certainly use the 3d6 inch charge stratagem, because the difference between making a charge or not making a charge with the Death Company is enormous, and could potentially lose you the game. When they charge, you'd have to be mindful of Overwatch. If you're charging something with an overwhelming amount of shots, then it might be worth trying to deep strike them behind a building or something to charge out of line of sight, and you'd have to think carefully about what you charge in terms of how much you can kill, and what they might be able to pile into to tie up. In particular, if they could kill a unit and then pile into another unit to surround or tri-point one of the models, then you could potentially prevent that unit from falling back and save your Death Company from being shot in the next turn. This will be very powerful if you could achieve it, and might be worth limiting their damage potential a little bit if it keeps them safe. Otherwise, you could just go hell for leather at the opponent's heavy hitters, hopefully kill them, maybe think about fighting again to try and take out as much of the army as possible. Death Company have really powerful stratagems, and it's going to be about how you use them best that will best help the Death Company. Once you have charged, you should probably think about where they're going to be after the charge, bonus points if you can get them in cover, or even better, out of line of sight. If they do survive to the next turn, then you'll have a very, very scary, threatening unit in the midst of the enemy, and you should have your pick of where you want to charge and who you want to kill. In the enemy's shooting phase, you could consider using Transhuman Physiology and Refusal to Die, or just one of those. I feel they're unlikely to save them if you are facing down a lot of guns, but it could make a big difference if your opponent only has limited guns that they can focus on the Death Company. Overall, I really like Death Company. They're a very solid, massively damage dealing unit that requires you to think a bit about their use because they're so fragile point for point. If you get 1 or 2 good charges off with a Death Company, then they can easily make their points back, but fail a key charge, expose them too much, or take too much Overwatch, and you could well be losing a very expensive unit for minimal reward. Obviously, we'd have to compare them against the counterparts of the Vanguard Vets, Sanguinary Guard, and Terminator squads for deep striking melee threats from the Blood Angels army. The Sanguinary Guard and the Vanguard Vets are both tougher point for point, but don't have quite the same damage output as the Death Company do, nor do they have their synergies with the Chaplains, and they can't do full-on Fury. Again, I think we might well look at these in some sort of comparison video at a later date, but I'll try and get the unit reviews done on the Sanguinary Guard too. So thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. We will of course be covering the other unique Blood Angels units over the next couple of weeks, and I'm certainly looking forward to doing so. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more Blood Angels and Space Marine content, or to contribute to my Patreon if you are enjoying my videos. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.